Hello to our friends joining us via recording. Today we are covering lab lesson number 9, which is all about the brain and the bones and the muscles of the skull. Notice that zombie Dr. Alice is making an appearance today. All about those brains. So lots of brains here in our lab classroom, lots of brains in your lab packet. We're going to start with reviewing the group work activities that we did to give us some hints to figure out the names of the parts of the brain. So the first thing we did when we split up into our groups is we reviewed the location of several of the skull bones. This week's lab packet, in addition to learning about the brain, we're relearning the names of skull bones and also the markings that we find on those bones. So let's start by reminding ourselves of the names of different bones. I'm going to put some numbers, so maybe that'll be a little bit easier for us to work together as a class to fill some things out here. All right, so as I'm putting some numbers on bones here, make sure I get all of them on our list. 2, 4, 6, perfect, okay. Let's start with bone number 1. This is the one that makes up your forehead. What's the name of bone number 1, the forehead bone that I see here? Yeah, exactly. The forehead bone is the one in the very front of the skull. This is called the frontal bone. The frontal bone is one of the few bones in the skull that we only have one of. A lot of your skull bones, we've got 2, one on the left and one on the right. Well, the frontal bone, your forehead, is just one flat bone all the way across. If we go right behind it to bone number 2, what's the name of this big bone back here, bone number 2, the big one? Yeah, Kira's right for us. That big one back there is called the parietal bone, the parietal bone. When I learned this way back in the day in high school, I used an anatomy coloring book. I'm not sure how many of you all picked up an anatomy coloring book just for fun, if you like to do that. I actually colored the parietal bone like green or teal to help me remember that this was my teal bone, my parietal bone that I have here on the back part of the skull. So if you printed your worksheets in black and white, you could consider coloring this bone back here kind of a green color or a teal color, the parietal bone that we have right here. If we go back behind it to the very back of your skull, what's the name of bone number 6 back here? Bone number 6 in the very back of your skull. Yeah, so this bone back here in the very back of the skull is called the occipital bone. The occipital bone. So this bone, as we're going to see later in class today, has several bumps on it on the back side of the occipital bone. They're very important for muscle attachment. We talked about this last week when we were talking about stuff with the legs. It's the same deal here for a lot of these bone markings of the skull. It's all about muscle attachment. So you'll see a couple of lines on the back of the occipital bone, or we'll see a big protuberance. All of those are for attaching muscles that we find in your back to help you move your head. So the occipital bone, really important for a muscle attachment for muscles that live down lower, down here. Bone number 3 that I see right here in pink, this is the one that's by your ears. Here's that thing we call the outside hearing hole, the external acoustic meatus. Yeah, this one over here is called the temporal bone. The temporal bone, it makes up your temples. By the way, this matches our regional term as well. In addition to us learning that this was the temporal bone, we learned that this was the temporal region that we see here. We learned that this was the occipital bone and that was the occipital region. So many of these things in anatomy that we see more than one time, that's on purpose. They're all related to each other. All right, let's go to the front part of your face. When we talk about your upper jaw, what's the name of bone number 4 that makes up the upper part of your jaw? Yeah, exactly. So the upper part of your jaw, that bone is called the maxilla. So all of your top teeth are embedded into this bone called the maxilla in the top. Down below it, we've got your jawbone, bone number 5. Yeah, the jawbone called the mandible. The mandible, absolutely. There's a couple of bones I didn't make you label on the list that we'll go ahead and label together here. So let's start with, I'm going to call this one here in blue. We'll call that bone number 7. I guess we're up to bone number 7 here. Does anyone happen to know the name of this bone right here, this blue one that makes up kind of the front part of your cheek? Yeah, absolutely. Several of us are mentioning in the chat the name of this blue bone here is called the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone. When you feel your cheekbone on the front of your face, you are feeling the zygomatic bone. If you follow that cheekbone back as it gets closer to your ear, that's part of the temporal bone. So the two bones that come together to give you your cheekbone that sticks out on your face, the temporal bone in the back and the zygomatic bone in the front. I know I had seen someone in the chat mention for me this purple one right here. Who are we looking at right here? The one that we find in the bridge of your nose. Yeah, exactly. That's the nasal bone. I think we talked about this before. If someone actually breaks their nose, this is the bone that they're breaking. There's a whole lot of cartilage that sticks out down below here to form the beginning of your airway. But we do actually have this bone up here, the place where glasses sit or sunglasses sit on your nose up here. This little bone right here is a little bit tricky. We can see it better on the inside, but does anyone happen to know who this purple bone is right here? So I've got a couple votes for the lacrimal bone. The lacrimal bone we could go ahead and label. See this little red one here inside the eye socket? That would be the lacrimal bone. Good guess. Ethmoid bone, I am not certain if we can see the ethmoid. It might be this green one right here. I'm going to put ethmoid with a question mark. Yeah, so a couple of us have mentioned in the chat the purple one is a bone called the sphenoid bone. So this one right here is called the sphenoid bone. Much easier to see inside the skull, and when we start looking inside the skull, we'll talk about it more. But the sphenoid bone is this one right here. It comes together with the temporal bone and the parietal bone and the occipital bone. All of these kind of in this group really help us to encase the brain. So we're thinking of them more as skull bones, where some of these, especially things that we see down here, we might consider them more facial bones. They're about facial expression or moving your jaw, those kinds of things. Yeah, so Kaylin mentioned she completely forgot about the sphenoid. Yeah, we don't usually think about the sphenoid bone in this view because it is so much easier to see in a different view. So full disclosure, I'm probably not going to ask you about the sphenoid bone in particular. There's a lot of other bigger, clearer bones in this picture, but for our review purposes, do make sure that we know that the sphenoid here is right in front of the temporal bone. All right, we've labeled the bones of the skull. There's a whole lot of bones that make up the skull. The reason I had you start with reviewing their names is because when we're talking about the lobes of the brain, which are the functional areas or the groups of stuff in the brain, their names match up with the names of several of those skull bones. So I labeled for you, for your reference, anterior versus posterior, superior versus inferior. Let's start with reminding ourselves, because directional terms was a long time ago. When we start with these terms here, anterior and posterior, what do anterior and posterior actually mean anterior and posterior. Yeah, so seen a lot of people mentioning front and back. Absolutely. So posterior means the back, toward the back side of the body. Anterior means toward the front of the body. Absolutely. When we're looking at a brain, it's important that we know which side is the front and which side is the back, because knowing where the front is helps me to know the name of this big blue lobe right here. Which lobe of the brain am I looking at right here? What lobe is the one here in the very front, or the anterior? Yeah, absolutely. This is not a trick question, right? This is the frontal lobe, the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is the lobe of the brain in the very front. Here's, if we don't recognize some of these dividing lines, which we'll talk about here in a bit, if we don't use the dividing lines and the general shape to help us predict the front from the back when we're looking at the brain, there's another structure that can actually help us tell front versus back, and it's this thing right here. So this is not color-coded because it's not part of the cerebrum. It's not part of the major thinking part of your brain. But does anyone happen to know what this uncolored structure down here is? Put a little line to it. Yeah, several of us chiming in. This one that we're seeing below the brain that helps us to know front versus back, this thing down here is called the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is kind of, the way I like to think about it, is the little cerebrum. So here's some terminology that you'll review in the lab packet. What we're looking at is the cerebrum. And when I think about the cerebrum, I consider it the thinking part of the brain, or this is the part that makes you human. So it's going to help you do, what I mean by this is it helps you to do all the tasks that make you different from an animal, or it helps you to do all of the higher level thinking, if you will. Several of us are mentioning in the chat completely correctly here, this part down below that we said helps us know front from back, the cerebellum. Big things with the cerebellum, it really helps us out with equilibrium, which is my fancy anatomy word for balance. Cerebellum really helps us out with balancing. It also helps us out with the way that we do muscle movements. When you get to lesson number 11 in lecture, so coming up after neurons, we'll dive into the brain, we will explore the fact that the cerebellum is one of the parts of your brain that's most easily influenced by alcohol. So keep that teaser in the back of your mind. When someone is given the roadside sobriety test, we make them do a lot of different things. Consider how the cerebellum is pretty easily impaired by alcohol. So all the things that drunk people do that make you know they're drunk, a lot of them come from the fact that the cerebellum's not functioning. Yeah, so Kaylin's totally right. Reasons why they're stumbling around, reasons why they look funny when they do stuff. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in lesson number 11. But the cerebellum, this part down here, doesn't really help you as much with thinking as much as it's all about that balance and coordination, helping you to move and not look funny, basically. That's your cerebellum. The cerebellum is always, always, always found on the back side of the brain. So anytime you're looking at a picture of a brain model, anytime you're looking at a sketch of the brain, like we're seeing here, to help you figure out front versus back, look for the cerebellum. That's always going to tell you where the back side is. The cerebellum will also always tell you too where the inferior side is. So we've got superior and inferior. What did those words mean? Superior and inferior. Yeah, exactly. So Kira's mentioning that inferior means something that's below or something that's lower. Absolutely. Yeah, I like that. Fanchon's mentioning the thing that's on the bottom. Absolutely. Bottom. Superior, meaning things that are above or up higher, or something that we might say is kind of on the top. Absolutely. That's going to be pretty easy to gauge compared to front and back, right? Because there's just nothing above the superior surface. But again, the cerebellum is found posterior toward the backside and inferior to this part right here called the cerebrum. So your directional terms back to haunt you, and we're using different structures of the brain to help us figure out which is where. All right, so we labeled this lobe up here, the one in the front. This one's the frontal lobe. Let's go all the way to the back, to the posterior lobe. What's the name of this pink one that I see back here in the very back of the skull? Yeah, my most posterior lobe is the occipital lobe, just like the occipital bone was back there. Hey, when we're thinking about the occipital lobe, its function is something that is maybe opposite of what you would expect based on its location. What does this part of your brain, the very back of your brain, help you out with? Do we know yet? Yeah, exactly. Several of us are mentioning this is the part of the brain that helps you with vision, with your ability to see things. So when you see something with your eyeballs that live up here, we send it all the way to the very back of the brain, the occipital lobe, in the very back of the brain. And that lobe is going to store information so you can process it. It's going to help you figure out what you're looking at. But the process of vision is what's happening here in this occipital lobe in the very back of the brain. Hey, next door to it is a lobe that's going to help us out with hearing. What's the lobe right here in green? Who helps me out with hearing? Yeah, the temporal lobe, exactly. Temporal lobe. So this is the temporal lobe by the temporal bone. This helps us out with hearing. The process of hearing in the temporal lobe, yeah, and Temiteo is reminding me we have one other special sense that sends information here to the temporal lobe, and that's the sense of smell. So when you smell things or when you hear things, we send that information to different parts of the temporal lobe, which is right by the temporal bone of the skull. Our last lobe that we can see on the outside of the brain is this yellow one up here. What's the name of this last lobe up here, this yellow one? Yeah, there's that parietal lobe, the very last one. When we think about the parietal lobe, think about this one as what we might call a general sensory lobe. So this is information, things like touch, things like temperature, things like stretching. This kind of information is what we call general sensory information. Things like vision, things like balance or hearing and smell, those are called special senses. So we're going to do a whole lecture chapter just on special senses. General sensory information, most of what you feel and experience is coming through this parietal lobe up here. I had a question in the chat about the fact that the occipital lobe helps with vision. So the actual part of your eyeball that perceives light is called the retina. We have special neurons in the retina that collect that sight information. And you're totally right, that information goes back here. So through what's called the optic nerve. Coming next week, we're going to learn about the special cranial nerves that bring information to the brain. The optic nerve sends its information all the way back here to the occipital lobe for us to process it. There is one lobe that I can't see on the outside of the brain. There's one lobe that's deep, kind of here in the middle. Yeah, a couple of us are chiming in. So I'm going to draw a little circle here. My little circle here that I'm seeing is representing my lobe that's found deep, called the insula. The insula, oops, cannot spell it. Okay, so this is my deep lobe, meaning I don't see it on the surface of the brain. But if I moved away, especially part of my temporal bone, or my temporal lobe, excuse me, and a little bit of my frontal lobe, I'd find it buried down here in the middle. What does the insula help with? Do we remember what the insula helps us to process? Yeah, this is everyone's favorite lobe, right? This is the one that helps us with taste. Taste. So deep down underneath some of our other lobes, we've got the insula. The insula helps us with taste. The temporal lobe, the lobe that we find by the temporal bone, helps us with hearing and also with the process of smell. We've got the occipital lobe that helps us with vision, and the parietal lobe that helps us with general sensory information. So some of the stuff that we listed here, I'll add to that list as well, because we'll talk about this later. The sensation of pain, that also comes through the parietal lobe. We haven't talked about the function of the frontal lobe, because the frontal lobe doesn't do sensory stuff. So everything else we've talked about, these 4 other lobes that we've labeled, they all do some kind of sensory type thing. Yeah, so the frontal lobe has a couple of different purposes. The first thing about the frontal lobe is it helps us with motor functions. So what I mean by motor functions is when you decide to type something, when you decide to sit up or to lay down, motor functions where you make conscious decisions to move, that comes from the frontal lobe. The other kinds of things that come from the frontal lobe, like Kira mentioned, this is where your personality comes from. Or this is really where thinking skills, this is really where those come from. Oops, I cut out there. Frontal lobe is where we do motor stuff. It's also where your personality and your ability to process or critically think comes from. So the frontal lobe in the front, one of the biggest differences between the frontal lobe and the other lobes of the brain is that this is a motor lobe, or this is a lobe that helps you out with thinking or your personality. Everybody else is doing sensory stuff, compared to our frontal lobe that's doing more of our motor and personality, that kind of stuff. Yeah, Fanshin mentions when you have a small child that's throwing a fit, this part of their brain is I would say, not necessarily say that they're not using it, as much as they're not using it well. When my daughter gets angry, we got some anger going on up here from the frontal lobe. Her fiery personality is demanding that she gets her own way. So this part of the frontal lobe does actually not finish fully developing until the 20s. So there's some work that still needs to be done, especially in a toddler. But yeah, like Kaylin's mentioning, in teenagers as well. Yeah, so it takes a while for us to really fully develop our critical thinking skills. The good news for all of us parents is that since the frontal lobe is where personality is as well, there's still hope for our young children whose personality needs a little bit of nurturing, shall we say. We're still working on my 4-year-old, that she is not the center of the universe. So that part of her personality, we're working on that. We still got plenty of time. I got like 20 years to teach her that. She'll be just fine. But for now, her frontal lobe is not quite up to snuff in that regard. We will come back to talking about this a little bit more, but I'll mention, you can see this black line right here. This black line is something that we'll label again on another model. This is called the central sulcus. the central sulcus. This central sulcus that divides up the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe, the way I like to remember that one, or remember the function of that one, everything behind it is sensory type stuff that we see here. And then everything in front of it is our motor type stuff. So that central sulcus, really important because it divides the sensory portions in the back from the motor portions in the front. So keep that in mind. We'll come back to this structure here in a moment. The one other thing I asked us to do with our groups was to start to think about bone markings, because there are a lot of bone markings this week. So I've highlighted a couple of them and given you some hints about how to process their names or make predictions about them. Remember, the more that you can predict in our class, or the more that you can kind of think your way through, the less that you're just pounding into your mind trying to memorize. There's only so much space for what you can actually memorize. So the more we can use hints and context clues, the better off we are. So our first structure that we're looking at right here is a little hole. Now I could have been mean and given you bone markings that not all of them mean a hole, but I decided not to do that to you here. Here's a quick reminder. Remember that anytime I see this word foramen, foramen always means a hole. So we've got on our bone markings list this week 3 different holes that we're trying to identify. Those 3 different holes, we can actually all see all 3 of them in our picture here. The one I asked you to predict was this one right here. So this one right here, I told you that we're supposed to use our regional terms and our directional terms to figure out what it's called. When I look at my names here, notice here in italics, we've got 2 different regional terms there. So one of our regional terms is the orbital region. One of our regional terms is the mental region. I'm pretty sure we all can remember what the orbital region means, or where is the orbital region located? Where's that region? Yeah, exactly. That's the eye region, right? Or the eye socket. That's called the orbit. Okay. The mental region is a little bit trickier. Do we happen to remember what the mental region was? Very nice. Either we all remember it, or we can use process of elimination, right? The mental region is the chin region. Yeah, so it's found by the mandible. Absolutely. Here's our 2 regional terms. Either something that's by the eye or something that's by the chin. This one looks pretty close to the eye for me, so I'm thinking it's going to be one of my orbital markings because it's by the eye. When we talk about the mental foramen, this mental word we said meant the chin, right? So if I look down here on top of my mandible, my chin region, see this dot right here in your chin? This is the mental foramen. So let me label that one for us. The mental foramen. It is a hole that I find in the chin region. So the mental foramen, you can use the fact that it's a foramen to know it's a hole, and mental to be that it's in the chin region. It literally means chin hole, mental foramen. Okay, I've got 2 holes. So let's go back to our orbital region, right? I've got 2 holes. I've got one hole that's above the eye and one hole that's below the eye. I'm asking you about the one that is below the eye. The one that's below is that infraorbital or supraorbital, if I'm below. Yeah, exactly. Infra is the one that means I am below. The infraorbital foramen, because infra is related to inferior. inferior. Here's where we remind ourselves of those words, right? You told me on the last slide that inferior means below. So the infraorbital foramen is the hole that is below the orbit. The supraorbital foramen relates to that word superior. Superior means above. So here's that supraorbital foramen that I have above the orbit. Here's my orbit and my hole above it. Here's my orbit and my hole below it, the infraorbital foramen. So bone marking number 1, infraorbital foramen. Oop, ignore that T. Throw a little line in it. Okay. Let's go over to our second set of structures. Notice our second set of structures, when we're looking at stuff here, these are all sutures. And sutures are something that we actually talked about in lecture, way back in lesson number 1, way back when anatomy was still easy, right? Back in the day for lesson number 1. Let's remind ourselves of some of that easy stuff from lesson number 1. When I talk about a suture, sutures do or do not move. Is a suture a joint that does or does not move? Exactly. Several of us are correct. Sutures are the attachment site between two bones that do not move. And yeah, like a couple of us are mentioning in the chat, that is a very good thing. We're grateful that they don't, because underneath these sutures, these connection sites, is your very delicate brain. So the brain lives underneath these sutures. These bones are attached to each other in a way that doesn't move to keep your brain safe. I told you with these sutures to use your body planes to figure out their names. So here's where we have to go through and remind ourselves what several of these words mean. Now, the lambdoid suture, this is one that's not named based on a body plane. So the one we're pointing to is not the lambdoid suture. I'll mention for us, that's this little one back here. There's my lambdoid suture. That one, there's not a body planes way to remember that one. You're just going to have to memorize that one. When we talk about the coronal suture and the sagittal suture, those ones get their names from body planes. So here I'm going to draw us a little person. When I've got a person, let's do some planes review here. When I've got a person and I'm talking about using a sagittal plane to divide them, how does a sagittal plane work? What kind of pieces does sagittal divide us up into? Do we remember? Yeah, exactly. A sagittal plane divides us left and right. So we can have equal left and right, that'd be mid-sagittal. We could have unequal left and right, that's parasagittal. So when we've got a little person here, if I'm doing a sagittal plane, I'm going to make a left side and a right side when I'm dividing this person into two parts. That's a sagittal plane. When I look at this line here that's going across my skull, this is not dividing the skull into a left part and a right part. This is dividing the skull into a front part and a back part. The kind of plane that divided us from a front part and a back part, that was the job of my coronal planes, So structure number 2 is the coronal suture. The coronal suture. It divides, remember, a coronal plane is front and back. That's my kind of pieces that I make. The other way you can consider is if we had a little crown sitting on top of this skull's head. I know we were saying the skull was so cute, right? So here's its little crown. That looks really terrible. I'll add some jewels to see if that helps at all. Here's our terrible little crown here. But our friend has a crown that's going up and down, or it's like a tiara, I guess, right? So it rests on the top, divides the front and the back. This coronal suture is the place where a corona, or where a crown, would rest on the head. The sagittal suture, by the way, I can't see it in this picture, in this view, but the sagittal suture actually goes all along the top part. So I just drew it on here for us. The sagittal suture actually connects the left and right parietal bones to each other. So the sagittal suture is actually found here, dividing the left and the right side. The coronal suture is found along here, dividing the front from the back. And then this little squiggly one that we see right here between the temporal bone and the parietal bone, this is the one right here called the squamous suture. So this squiggly one on the side, that's your squamous suture. This squamous suture right here. Yeah, I like that. Fanchen said this one looks like it's a squished suture. Absolutely, just like the squamous cells were squished, right? So the little squished wiggly one, that's the squamous suture. The lambdoid suture in the back, then the sagittal suture in the middle, and the coronal suture here in the front. How do we feel about these bone markings, about our lobes, about those bones? Thumbs up, thumbs down, or questions? Kaylin, are you asking for help, or you said that this helped? I can't tell. Could interpret that either way. It helps to blow your mind. Got it. Okay, well, let's dive into more of the lab stuff here and work our way through some other new ideas. We already labeled the lobes of the brain. I'll just mention when you get to this part of your lab packet, when it's talking about that inner lobe that you're not able to see, remind me again, what was the name of the inner lobe that's in the very middle of the brain? Who's that one that lives in the middle? Yeah, exactly. So that one in the very middle is called the insula. When you're working on the homework assignment, notice that this arrow is pointing not really at any one lobe that's superficial. So when you see this arrow that seems to kind of be pointing in the middle of nowhere, and it'll have a note about being the inner lobe, that's asking for the insula. If my arrow is instead pointing to this lobe right here, who was this lobe right here next to your ear? Yeah, this one here was the temporal lobe. So if my arrow is instead pointing right here, that's the temporal lobe. If my arrow is pointing here all the way anterior, that's going to be that frontal lobe, the frontal lobe in the front. Or if we're pointing all the way in the back, there's that occipital lobe in the way back. And then this big lobe here, kind of on the top back, that's the parietal lobe back there. So watch for this one here. When it talks about something that's inner or something that's deep, that's the insula. Otherwise, we can see the rest of them just on the very surface of the brain. We talked about how when we're looking at the brain, and those different lobes that we just looked at here, that there was an important difference. There's that dividing line that I told us we needed to know. What's the name of this dividing line that we see here between the red and the blue? Yeah, so this dividing line between the red and the blue is called the central sulcus. Absolutely, the central sulcus. I see Kaylin is mentioning that she thinks this one is a backwards brain. So here's what I'll say to that. We are actually looking at the other side of the brain now. Your brain has a left side and a right side, right? We have two different hemispheres. They do some of the similar jobs, but not exactly the same. This would be the right side of a person's brain. If I flip back over here, this is the left side of their brain. It doesn't matter if we're looking at the left side or the right side. The positions of my lobes are still the same. So what I mean by that is this is when we need to figure out that front side and that back side. So when we're looking at a brain, I told you that this structure down here is the one that helps us to know the front from the back. Who do we see living down there? That one, that structure I put an arrow to. Yeah, that structure down there is called the cerebellum. Cerebellum. Remember, the cerebellum is always on the back side of the brain, the posterior side of the brain. So even if I'm looking at the left side, or even if I'm looking at the right, doesn't matter. As long as I see that cerebellum, I know where the back side of the brain is. So we're looking at a flip or a mirror image of what we've labeled so far. This is on the anterior side of my brain. So this big red-orange lobe that we're seeing up here is our frontal lobe, the frontal lobe. Can you remind me in the chat, what did we say was the function of the frontal lobe? What does the frontal lobe do? Yeah, so Kira's right. This is things like motor functions, absolutely, making stuff happen. Our ability to think, yeah, doing that critical thinking or some of that processing. Yeah, reasoning, love it. And I'll add personality to our list. Perfect. Those are the kind of things that happen in the frontal lobe. Then we have that structure that we talked about before, that we labeled and it went away, called the central sulcus. Central sulcus, that divides up the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, back here in blue, the parietal lobe, here in blue. Then we've got on the side that temporal lobe, like we already talked about. And in the very, very back, I know it's kind of hard to see back here. Who's that one? That's a little bit hard to see. Yeah, exactly. That last one called the occipital lobe of the brain. Yeah, so Kaylin is bringing us back to the thing we actually made you label on this model. So now we'll actually make you label it. This bump right here, shown in dark red, and this bump right here, shown in light blue, these are two very important bumps in the brain. So terminology that we use to describe the brain has bumps that are called a gyrus. Gyrus equals a bump or something that's raised. And then it's got those indentations that are called a sulcus. So our indentation, that's called a sulcus. So the central sulcus is this dividing line that divides up the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Why we care about the central sulcus is because the two bumps, the two gyri on either side of it, are really, really important from a functional perspective. So this red bump that's part of the frontal lobe, this is something called the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus. This has, the easy way to describe what it has is we'll call it a motor map of your body, a motor map of your body. The technical name for it is something called the motor homunculus. The motor, I spelled that wrong. We're going to try again. Motor homunculus. That's my fancy anatomy word for map. If you have not already, I would encourage you to download the lesson number 11 handout for lecture, because it shows you a picture of the motor homunculus. Basically what it means is that all the different parts on this gyrus, this bump here, they all control different parts of your body. So when we get toward the middle of the precentral gyrus up here, this is going to control things like your feet, for example. We come over here kind of on the side, and the neurons that live here control your face. So this motor homunculus is the location in the brain along this one bump that I see right here that has all of the neurons that control the skeletal muscle in different places in your body. So again, check that out in lesson number 11 for lecture. You can see what this map looks like, the motor homunculus. We find that in the precentral gyrus. Pre means before. The precentral gyrus is the bump that's before the central sulcus. Behind it, we have what's called the post-central gyrus. Post means after. So the post-central gyrus is found after the central sulcus or behind the central sulcus. This is going to have a sensory map of your body, or in our fancy anatomy terms, a sensory homunculus. Again, what that means is this part of the bump might be processing information from your feet, while this part over here might be processing information from your cheeks, or this part might be working on your fingers. Different parts of this bump collect sensory information from different parts of your body. So this central sulcus divides up the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, but from a functional perspective, it also divides up this really important motor part of your brain from this really important sensory part of your brain. The central sulcus. If I'm going to ask you to identify that, I promise you I'm going to use this color-coded model, because otherwise it's really hard to tell which indentation we're talking about. So the central sulcus, this line right here, that divides up the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. I had seen a note in the chat, I like this. When we're comparing sulcus to gyrus, Audrey was saying, think about a sulcus as sulking because you can't see it. It's down too low. It's not on display. So my sulci, which is the plural for a sulcus, all of those indentations, they're down low. They're sulking because no one can see them. The gyrus is stealing all the glory. I like that a lot. That's perfect. In addition to dividing up the various lobes that we've labeled in the brain, the other thing that we need to be familiar with is how we divide up the two halves of the brain. So halves of the brain are called hemispheres. When we talk about the hemispheres, what divides them is something called the longitudinal fissure. Longitudinal fissure. This fissure word is like a sulcus, but on steroids. It's like way deeper. So the longitudinal fissure divides up the left side and the right side of the brain, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain, to use our terminology. Then we move into our little friend down here. This is the friend that is inferior to the cerebrum. Remind me again, when we're talking about this, what is this structure called? Not the specific labels, but the whole thing. Yeah, so the whole thing that we're looking at, the whole part of the brain we're looking at is called the cerebellum. The cerebellum. This was that part, remember, that we said helped you with balancing and equilibrium. When we talk about the cerebellum, it has a lot of the same features as the cerebrum. So what I mean by that is each of these halves of the cerebrum we called a hemisphere. Well, each of these halves of the cerebellum we also call a hemisphere. So when we're labeling these, we call these the cerebellar hemispheres because they're part of the cerebrum. The cerebellar, excuse me, they're not part of the cerebrum. The cerebellar hemispheres, the two halves, left and right, what connects them together is a new term for us. The structure that connects them is something called the vermis. Yeah, absolutely, the vermis. Does anyone remember from the guided lesson? What does that word vermis mean? Did I tell you what it meant? Oh, you would know if I told you. Okay, so this word vermis literally in Latin means worm. So the two halves, the two hemispheres of the cerebellum are connected by this little worm structure called the vermis. The vermis attaches the left side and the right side of the cerebellum to each other. When we look inside the cerebellum, this is probably one of the prettiest structures that we actually see in the body. I love this structure here. Does anyone remember what we call this white matter inside the cerebellum? It's one of Dr. Hollis's favorites. Yeah, exactly. So this white matter is something called the arbor vitae. Arbor vitae. Literally, that name means tree of life. Tree of life. So the arbor vitae is the white matter that's in the middle of the cerebellum. Fun fact that we don't make you know, but it's kind of cool to know. This is the name of the white matter, the arbor vitae. When we talk about the gray matter that's on the outside, the gray matter on the outside is actually called the folia, like foliage, like leaves. So this is the gray matter, the folia. The arbor vitae is the white matter. Two different colors that we see inside the cerebellum. I know you all aren't as much of a nerd as me, but I would encourage you at some point after class today to do a Google Images search for arbor vitae. It is very pretty, like Kira's mentioning. In real life and not just on models, it looks really beautiful. So the white matter inside called the arbor vitae, the gray matter on the outside, you don't have to know it, but it's called the folia. We got a tree motif going on here in that cerebellum. Right? It sounds sophisticated. Yeah, Latin will do that for you, right? To help us with labeling some of our other structures, I'm going to skip ahead to this model. Can you tell me what page we're on with this model here? Because I'm going to use this model to talk about the brain stem and the diencephalon and all that fun stuff. Okay, so we're on page 5 of the lab packet. We're going to jump to that picture on page 5. We have already labeled several of the things that we can see in this picture. So let's work on the things that we've already labeled. Let's start with, I'm going to draw a line for our lobes here. So let's start with the lobes that we can see in this picture. This lobe that I'm seeing right here, I hope we all know it by this point. Which lobe lives right here in the brain? Just behind the nose. Who's up here? Yep, this is our frontal lobe of the brain. Absolutely. Okay, we got the frontal lobe. The lobe that we find just behind it, right here. What's the name of the lobe who lives just behind the frontal lobe? Yep, that's the parietal lobe. And then our one there in the very back is the occipital lobe. Okay, first thing we've talked about so far, the lobes of the brain. These are the only ones I can see from the cross section, so it's the only ones I have to label. We talked about this structure, the thing that's below the cerebrum. Who's this? This whole structure here. Yeah, this down here is the cerebellum. And remember, you can see that white matter inside of it called the arbor vitae. That's the white matter. So we can see that in the cerebellum here. Let's talk about some of the other structures that we see on our picture here. This structure right here that I'm running my finger across, it looks like number 4. This is an underline highlight star. You must know this. There is a 0% chance this will not show up on your exam. Like, I'm guaranteeing you, we're going to ask you about this one. So this structure right here, this white band that I see right here, we got to know this guy. This guy is what we call the corpus callosum. Yeah, absolutely, the corpus callosum. We have just got to know this. This is a must know. I'm going to put it in a little box on here. We got to know this. The job of the corpus callosum is to connect the left and the right halves of the brain together, the corpus callosum. So it's this band of white matter. If we go down inside the longitudinal fissure that divides the left and the right parts of the brain, this part is not divided. This is the part where the left and the right attach to each other. So this is the corpus callosum that we see up here. So to your question, Kaylin, it's this whole thick white band that we see right here. It does not include this white band. I can't remember, did we make you learn this structure here? Okay, so Kira says we made you learn it. Now would be a good time then for us to go ahead and label it. Oops, let me get black back. What is this other white band structure that we're seeing right next door? It actually is not involved in connecting left and right. Yeah, so this is a structure called the fornix. The fornix. This is part of a region of the brain called the diencephalon, the middle inside part. The fornix has to do with memories. So this white line that we see down here, the lower one, this helps to feed into our memory system in the brain. This much larger white line that we see up here, called the corpus callosum, this connects the left and the right side to each other. Let's look, we're going to transition down to this part of the brain right here that I always say kind of looks like a duck face. Got a little bit of a duck face going on here. So when we talk about this duck face, let's talk about this whole region in general. So the whole head of our duck, we're going to do that. Let me draw my little line out here. The head of our duck is a region of the brain called the thalamus. The thalamus. So this whole circle region that we see here, that's the thalamus of the brain, or the head of the duck. The eye of this duck right here, this brown spot, since it's in the middle of the thalamus, we call it the interthalamic adhesion. Did we make you learn that? The interthalamic adhesion? Okay, I'm saying yes, perfect. This is my duck eye. The interthalamic adhesion, it's in between the two halves of the thalamus. This little part of tissue right here does the same thing that the corpus callosum does, but this is going to connect the left and the right side of the thalamus together. So my duck eye is the interthalamic adhesion. Yeah, or it's sometimes, okay, did we call it the intermediate mass? Maybe that's what we called it. Apologies. Gotta love how anatomy has different names for the same thing. You're totally right. Let me circle the one we had you learn. The intermediate mass of the thalamus. Apologies. That's the duck eye, the intermediate mass. When we look at the duck, we also, I kind of covered it a little bit, but there's kind of a duck bill. Here, I'll draw it in orange. The bill of my duck, in front of its face, in front of the thalamus, this is an area that we call the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is kind of below the thalamus. So a lot of the thalamus is up higher than this hypothalamus part. Back behind the thalamus, above some of it, there's a little bump right here. This little bump is a structure that we call the epithalamus. Epithalamus, that means above. Epi means above. So the bump that I have that's kind of on the back above some parts of the thalamus, that's the epithalamus. The only part of the epithalamus that we're making you learn in lab and in lecture too, for that matter, it's called the pineal gland. The pineal gland. Did we make you learn the function of the pineal gland for lab? Okay. What does the pineal gland help us to do? We either love or hate what the pineal gland does. Yeah, exactly. The pineal gland makes melatonin. Melatonin is what makes you sleepy. You're supposed to make melatonin at bedtime, right? We might make melatonin at the wrong times of day, but we're supposed to make melatonin at night. That's what, like Kira mentioned, is a thing called circadian rhythms. How your body is supposed to get tired at night and it's supposed to wake up energized in the morning. So the pineal gland makes melatonin. Yeah, just like the melatonin you can buy at the store. Absolutely. Yeah, Kaylin mentions that she takes hers, but only at night. That's a good plan. Probably don't want to take that in the morning unless you're planning to sleep all day, which sounds really awesome to a mom of 2 littles, sleeping all day. Sign me up. All right, we have the epithalamus above the thalamus. We've got the big portion of the middle of the brain called the thalamus. We've got the hypothalamus next to it. I believe, did we also make you know this structure right here that I just drew a line to? Okay. Yeah, so this structure right here, this is another endocrine system structure. Endocrine system, meaning it makes hormones. Yeah, Kira's right. This one's called the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland. So this pituitary gland, when you take AMP2, you are going to study a whole bunch of the hormones that the pituitary gland makes. It's in charge of a lot of important stuff in your body. So pituitary gland right here, that's an endocrine organ. It makes hormones. The pineal gland is also considered an endocrine organ. The melatonin that we talked about, that is a hormone that our body makes. So 2 endocrine organs that we see in this middle portion of the brain. Then we go down into this region right here, which is kind of our last stop when we're talking about the brain. This region right here is something called the brain stem. When you think about the brain stem, think about basic life functions. So the brain stem is what keeps you alive. I say that because we've got things like this big bump on the front. So let me draw my arrow. This big bump region here on the front is something called the pons. The pons. The pons is really important for breathing rate. So setting how often you breathe in and out. We have a thing called the pontine respiratory center in this area called the pons, the bridge. Just below it, we have this bump area here. This bump area is called the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata also helps with breathing rate, but it's also important for heart rate as well. So some of your basic life functions being controlled by the pons, and down below it, the medulla oblongata. We've also got this region right here that connects the thalamus to the pons. So this little region right here is what we call the brain's, the midbrain. Excuse me, I always get those mixed up. So let's pick a color here. I'm gonna put a blue box around the midbrain. Okay. So this blue box is an area called the midbrain. And the midbrain is really important for reflexes. So this is things like when you hear a really loud sound and you jump, or when you see something flying at your head and you duck so it doesn't hit you. Those are reflex actions. And those are the kinds of things that the midbrain does for you. So these three parts that together are called the brainstem, they're all about keeping you alive or keeping you safe. When we're talking about big picture thinking and feeling and processing, that's the cerebrum with those different lobes. And then some of my relaying type functions, connecting things together or making hormones, that's some of the stuff that's done here in the middle of the brain as well, in that part called the diencephalon. Other than the meninges, was there anything else we were supposed to label on here? Because I want to talk about the corpora quadrigemina. Okay, to do that, I'm actually probably gonna clear my screen because I've got so much mess going on. By the way, aren't you all glad that you watched us do this in real time and didn't just like pull this picture up after class? Because I look at this and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. So I'm glad we built it together because it's a little bit less intimidating when you do it together. All right, here goes away. The corpora quadrigemina. That's the one thing that I missed besides the meninges. Let's talk about these guys. So see this thing right here labeled 18. On some of our models, you'll see it look a little bit more like a set of two bumps because there's two of them on each side. So these are called corpora quadrigemina. Corpora quadrigemina. Corpora literally means bodies. Quadrigemina means four. Corpora quadrigemina. It's a series of four bumps that are on the back side of the midbrain. Again, these are really important, like we were talking about, for our auditory and visual reflexes. Auditory and visual reflexes. These four bumps. We see kind of one big one here, but there's actually four of them total. Okay, I know this model is ugly. I know we labeled it super ugly on the last slide. Are there any last minute questions on it before we go back to talk about those meninges? We'll find them first on the special model, and then we'll come back and label them here. Yeah, it's hard to find some of these parts. Invisible body. Yeah. I highly recommend this week, please take advantage of those practice assignments. Remember when you're looking invisible body that you can actually type in. So if you pull up the assignment for the brain, you can actually type in corpus callosum and hit search, and it'll show you where it is. You can also dissect down to it because you're going to have to on the quiz, right? But I definitely recommend trying to play around with it, invisible body, to try to see things. But yeah, especially some of our structures here on the inside, absolutely, we're going to have to dig a little bit for it. So I know that it can be challenging. Give yourself, I mean, you all are here, right? So I don't have to tell you this, but give yourself plenty of time on this particular visible body assignment. Okay, let's bounce back. I'm actually going to go to a picture that you had from the guided lesson. When we talk about the brain is in the middle of the skull. So we can see our two hemispheres in the skull here. We can see the skull around it. But the brain isn't right next to the skull. There's some connective tissue and there's some fluid that helps it out. So when we talk about the connective tissues that wrap around the brain to protect them, that's what this word meninges over here on the left, that's what meninges are. So they're the connective tissue layers that wrap around the brain that separate it from the skull to help protect it. When we're learning the meninges, each of these meninges has the word motor in its name. So I know that it's been excluded here from this second name. Let me add it. So we've got what's called the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, the pia mater, all of these making up those meninges. And yeah, Audrey asked the question, great correlation to make. Meningitis, which is what we all get vaccinated for. Meningitis, yes, is when these layers, these three layers, start to swell. So imagine this little thin layer that touches your brain getting way thicker and putting pressure on your brain. That's meningitis. Or these, we've got a total of 3 of them. So if any of them start to swell, that's bad news for you because that's going to put pressure on your brain. So meningitis, the inflammation of these meninges layers that are supposed to protect your brain, not squeeze your brain. Okay, so let's look at the brain. Remember that the brain, we talked a little bit about this. It's got some gray matter that looks darker, and then some white matter that looks lighter. On the very outside of the gray matter of the brain is a layer of connective tissue called the pia mater. So the pia mater, this is what we would call the deepest meninge layer. It's the closest to the brain. It touches it the most. Outside of the pia mater, there's actually a fluid-filled space where we have some cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. If you remember, we talked about that way back in Unit 1 as one of our extra fluids in the body. So I've got this open space with cerebrospinal fluid, and right on the outside of that is what's called the arachnoid mater. So if you see all these little spider webs that are kind of hanging down, that's how it got its name, the arachnoid mater. That's my intermediate or my middle connective tissue layer. And the very outermost layer, the thickest layer, is what we call the dura mater. And dura technically means tough. So this is the toughest and the thickest connective tissue layer. It's found actually touching the bones. So we've got the dura mater, that's superficial, the arachnoid mater with those spider webs, that's intermediate, and then the pia mater, which is actually touching the brain, or it's right there with the brain. When we're talking about these different layers then, we've got a couple of spaces in between them. So let me help you orient. We talked about it using this picture. Let's go to this picture down here. Imagine that this part we're seeing in our picture right here, imagine that we just took this part of this one and blew it up really big. So we zoomed in a little bit closer to see this one over here. So you can still see that pink pia mater, the layer that's directly touching the brain. You can still see this lighter pink layer. This is the arachnoid mater with all its little spiderweb legs hanging down. And then the dura mater is white on this picture as well. The cerebrospinal fluid-filled space where all those spider webs are at, that's the area, like Elapina mentioned, that's the area called the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space. So right here where I've got cerebrospinal fluid, that's my subarachnoid space here in the middle. That's found between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, or underneath, sub means underneath, the arachnoid mater, the subarachnoid space. The other space for us to know is this space shown here in blue. This blue space is what we call the dural venous sinus, or it's an open space for blood. Dural venous sinus. This sinus word means a blood vessel that's really open. So I've got the dural venous sinus that I actually form when I have a space in between the parts of the dura mater. And then I've got the subarachnoid space that's in between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. Does anyone remember from studying or can tell from the picture, what do I find inside the dural venous sinus? I chopped out at some part, it sounds like, from the chat. What was the last thing we heard before it got dicey? Something about blood. Okay, so we heard a little bit about the dural venous sinus. So here's what I said that maybe we didn't hear. The dural venous sinus is when parts of the dura mater split apart from themselves. So we have this space in between the layers of the dura mater. It's so thick that it has more than one layer. So there's space inside here for blood, like Fanchen mentioned. I have blood inside the dural venous sinus, because this is a blood vessel, a sinus. And then I've got cerebrospinal fluid inside here in the subarachnoid space. Yeah, so Elapina asked if this is the same thing as a dural sinus. Yeah, if we had you label it just a dural sinus, that's correct. Dural sinus, or yeah, I guess that's what they called it, right? So more specifically, we'd call it the dural venous sinus. I think that's what we called it in the lab packet, correct? Is that what we had you label it? Yeah, so dural venous sinus, the blood vessels up here. Now let's take these pictures and transfer it to the model that we're actually studying. When we look at the model, we need to label the meninges and the spaces. So let's orient ourselves with the picture again. This down here is the brain. I can see parts of the brain. I've got the gray matter of the brain that's found superficial on the outside. And then I've got the white matter of the brain that's found in the middle. Right on top of that gray matter of the brain, what was the name of the connective tissue layer that's actually attached to the brain? Which mater or which meningeal layer is attached to the brain? Yeah, exactly, the pia mater. The pia mater. So the pia mater is my connective tissue brain or layer connected directly to the brain. Pia, by the way, means gentle or merciful. So this really thin, gentle layer that touches the brain, pia mater. Fanchen asked what kind of tissue it is. That's actually a great question that I don't for sure know the answer to. I would guess dense, irregular connective tissue, but I don't know that for sure. So I'll put that on my list to do a little checking for you. I know it's made out of proteins, so some kind of connective tissue, put it that way. A very thin layer of connective tissue called the pia mater. Our next layer is the layer where we can see all those little spider webs. So you can see them here, this seafoam green layer. What was the name of this next layer that has the spider webs in it? Which mater or meningeal layer are we looking at here? Yeah, so Kira mentioned our space. We can label the space. I'll draw a little box for our space too. We can do that. Our space is called the subarachnoid space. Yeah. Oh no, you're good, Kira. It does look like I was pointing that space, the space, doesn't it? So those spiderweb looking things that are hanging down from the arachnoid mater. So our seafoam green layer that puts down these little legs that we see here, this is the arachnoid mater. Underneath the arachnoid mater is this space here called the subarachnoid space. On top of the arachnoid mater, we can see the really thick connective tissue layer. What's this really thick connective tissue layer here? Yeah, so the really thick layer that I put in a box, that's the dura mater. The dura mater. So the dura mater right here, remember that it has the ability to split into two parts. when it splits into two parts, we have a space that we see right here. Now in real life, that space isn't empty. In real life, it's filled with blood. This space that I just colored in red, what's the name of that red space where I just filled it in for us here? Yeah, exactly. The red space that I just colored on, that's the dural venous sinus, the open space where there's blood. This open space forms in the middle of this thick dura mater layer, which is the last connective tissue layer around the brain. Audrey mentioned one of the other things that we do ask you to label on this picture, and that's the bone connective tissue. We can actually see the bone connective tissue best in this whole strip right here. So I guess I should have just done another rectangle. This strip that we see right here, this is our bone connective tissue. Cannot spell. There we go. Hey, check this out. This is bone connective tissue. This part of it looks like it has some space in between the bony parts. Which kind of bone am I seeing here in the middle of this bone connective tissue? What's the kind of bone that's there in the middle? Yeah, exactly. So there in the middle is my spongy bone. And you can see on the top and on the bottom, we can see our compact bone. See, most of the bones in your body that are, well, all of the bones in your body that are flat bones have this thin layer of compact bone on the outsides, and then this thin layer of spongy bone in the middle. So we can see spongy bone and compact bone. We don't make you identify the two of them. We just make you know that it's bone tissue. But when we're looking at it, we can see the compact bone and we can see that spongy bone mixed there in the middle. Fanchen did a little detective work for me, and she confirmed that at least the dura mater is made out of dense irregular connective tissue. So perfect. I was on the right track. Dense irregular connective tissue. Perfect. So all of this that we're seeing here, all this brown, that's proteins, that dense irregular connective tissue where there's proteins going nuts in all kinds of directions. Any questions about this model before we label the meninges on that cross section? Okay, so we ask you to label a little bit on the brain. Temiteo reminded us that we have to label a gyrus and a sulcus. Can you remind me in the chat, what does gyrus mean? What's a gyrus again? Exactly. Yep. So a gyrus or gyri are bumps, are raised parts. So I might say that that's a gyrus. I would say that that's a gyrus. Even this could be a gyrus. When we're talking about a sulcus, the sulci are the indentations, right? They're sulking because they're so small. Let me trade colors here. You can see a small sulcus. I just highlighted it in blue. Or you can see a larger sulcus. I'm gonna put a bigger circle around that one. There's a larger sulcus right there. So a place where we dip down in our brain tissue. This open space here is a sulcus. There's also a little tiny sulcus right here as well. Either of those would work. So if we go back to our cross-section model, on the cross-section model, we can see some of those meningeal structures that we talked about. Really, we can just see a couple of them. One of them we can see is this blue. This blue that we're seeing here is that blood-filled area that we saw on our other model. What's the name of this blue line again? That place where blood can pour into. It's a long one for me to think you type. Yeah, so the area where I find blood is the dural venous sinus. The dural venous sinus is found in between the two layers of the dura mater. So these white layers, I'll try to label them maybe over here. The two white layers that you see on either side of the blue are my dura mater. Dura mater, the thick connective tissue that has a space for blood in the middle. We don't ask you to label the subarachnoid space, but you can kind of see it if you squint with me. See these areas that are kind of black? So I'm kind of putting a line toward them. If we asked you to label them, which we do not, so you don't have to worry about this, but I'm just pointing out that those would be areas where we'd have the subarachnoid space, where there's a space. We can't see the arachnoid mater, it's too small. We can only barely see the dura mater, right? But the space underneath it, the pia mater would be attached to the brain, and then this empty space we see here, that'd be our subarachnoid space. You're just responsible, I believe, for dura mater and the dural venous sinus on this structure. All right, I have 15 minutes left. I want to open the floor for what we would like to talk about. Can you tell me in the chat where we want to spend our last 15 minutes? The options are bone markings, muscles, and movements. Bone markings, muscles, movements. Vote in the chat where you want to spend the rest of our time. Make a list for us. Bone markings, muscles, or movements. Audrey asked if we could add nap time to the list. Oh, I wish. If you can convince my 4-year-old to take a nap, then maybe we can put nap time on the agenda too. Okay, well, I am getting votes for muscles and movements, and not really any other preferences. So let's kill 2 birds with 1 stone. We'll label those muscles together and talk about their movements while we label them. And then we'll do that prediction activity at the end. When we are talking about the muscles of the face or of the head, want to remind you that we have some regional terms and we have some of those muscle naming things that pop up, just like we did way back when we first learned about muscles. So what I mean by that is I've got a couple of muscles that have the name orbicularis as part of their name. What does orbicularis mean? Does anyone remember what that word meant? Orbicularis. Yeah, so orbicularis, Kira mentioned the way I like to remember it is it's kind of like an orb. Orbicularis muscles are circles, circle muscles. Orbicularis, it means circle. Oculi and oris, this is where we start getting into, some of us were mentioning regional terms. This is where we start to get into those regional terms. Is it oculi or oris that means eye? Which of these meant the eye? Do you remember? Oculi or oris? Yeah, so oculi, like the oculars on a microscope, that's going to be the one whose name means eye, tells us its location. When we talk about the oris muscle, that's a circle muscle not found by the eye. Where is the oris muscle found? What's that one next to? Exactly. The oris muscle is found by that oral region, which is the mouth region. So orbicularis oculi is the circle muscle by the eye. Orbicularis oris is the circle muscle by the mouth. So if we go to our picture, we'll actually go to our muscle man here. Notice how I've got this big circle muscle around the eye. I see it around both of them. I've got this circle muscle around the mouth. These are my orbicularis muscles. Orbicularis oris down here. Orbicularis oculi up here. If we go to muscle man, if we're looking up close and personal on muscle man, the circle right here around his eye, this is orbicularis oculi. Down below it is orbicularis oris, the circle around his mouth. So orbicularis muscles, always circle muscles. A couple of these have bone names or regional terms in their names. Which part, if you were to describe it, how would you describe the location of the frontalis muscle? Where is the frontalis muscle found? Yeah, so Kira says the frontal region, right? Absolutely. So the frontal region, that's your forehead, right? The frontalis is this big muscle that I can see here. It's also the muscle that I can see here. I'm going to blame this muscle for the forehead wrinkles that I have gotten since lockdown. I feel like I started lockdown without any forehead wrinkles, and my children have made me raise my eyebrows so much that I officially have some of those etched wrinkles in my forehead. Yeah, Kaylin's telling me to not do Botox. We're going to talk about Botox tomorrow. If I were to do Botox for anything, be for those forehead wrinkles, but I will take a pass. So frontal region, this frontalis muscle allows you to raise your eyebrows, or we could say wrinkle up your forehead. The temporalis muscle is found in the temporal region. The temporal region over here above your ears. Hey, I want to mention, because I've heard this from a couple of my faculty members, when you are doing this muscle assignment in visible body, there is a layer of connective tissue on top of the temporal muscle, on top of temporalis. You need to dissect away that connective tissue before you actually get to the temporalis muscle. So if you're working on visible body and you know you're clicking in the right region and it's telling you it's wrong, take out that little dissect tool, do a quick dissect, and it'll get you to the temporalis muscle, not to that connective tissue on the outside. So temporalis over here on the outside of the skull. Zygomaticus major. Zygomaticus major is known as the smiling muscle. So when you're trying to find the location of zygomaticus major, it actually anchors into the outside of the mouth when it contracts and pulls your lips upward toward the zygomatic bone right here. That makes you smile. So muscle number 5 right here, that's zygomaticus major. Zygomaticus major is also this one over here, zygomaticus major, attaching to the corner of the mouth up to the zygomatic bone. The masseter muscle is a muscle that's really important in mastication, which is chewing. The best view of the masseter muscle is this right here. So we've got a salivary gland that you can see right here next to the ear. Underneath it, this muscle that goes up and down, that's the masseter muscle attached to the mandible over here. You can also see the masseter muscle over here. So the masseter is what helps to elevate your jaw to bring it upwards, the masseter muscle here. Last one on our list is the sternocleidomastoid. The sternocleidomastoid muscle is a muscle whose name tells us everywhere it attaches. This sterno part of its name, what bone does sterno sound like? Yeah, a couple of us chiming in. Sterno sounds like sternum. The sternocleidomastoid starts on the sternum. It goes up to the mastoid process, which is a bone marking that we're learning. It's back behind the ear. The mastoid process of the occipital or the temporal bone, excuse me. And it also attaches to the clavicle. That's what cleido stands for. So sternocleidomastoid. It's kind of a little bit triangle shaped because it's attached to the sternum and the clavicle, and then it goes up to the mastoid process. So we can see it here. Ooh, red was the wrong color. We can see it here, and we can also see it really well here. Sternocleidomastoid. Yeah, so there was a couple of questions in the chat about actions. Let's go through these briefly. When we're talking about the muscles that helped us to elevate the eyebrows, so raise up your eyebrows. Who did we say raises the eyebrows? Who's given Dr. Allis those forehead wrinkles? Yeah, the forehead wrinkles, that's my frontalis muscle. Thank you very much, frontalis. Okay. When we talk about closing the eyelids, we want something that squeezes them shut. My one muscle that squeezes them shut is the one that makes a circle around the eyeball. Yeah, so this is orbicularis oculi, squeezing the eye shut. When we're squeezing the lips shut, again, that's going to be an action of a circular muscle, right? So that's a job of orbicularis oris. So we pucker our lips or we close them. We have two muscles, and here's what the chat was talking about. Two muscles that are going to elevate the mandible. Remember, we talked about on our muscle words, elevate is the opposite of, elevation is the opposite of depression. So elevation, we pull the mandible up. Depression, we would drop it down. When we talk about elevating the mandible, my primary muscle who does this is the masseter. That's the big one that does it. And then we talked about that one before. And in the chat, we were talking about how the other muscle that helps us to elevate or to lift up the mandible is also the temporalis muscle. So the muscle that lives on your temple, you can actually feel this too when you clench your jaw. You can feel a little bit of tightening just above your ears because the temporalis muscle lives up there. It's helping to elevate the jaw. When we talk about retracting the mandible, so when your jaw goes backwards, who is it that pulls the jaw backwards? Somebody we already talked about. We just talked about. Yeah, exactly. That's the other job of temporalis. Temporalis pulls the jaw backwards and it pulls the jaw up. Two things that temporalis does. Masseter pulls the jaw up. Frontalis raises up your eyebrows. Orbicularis oculi closes your eyes. And then orbicularis oris closes your mouth. These theoretically should be some easy muscle movements to memorize. It's a way lot less than last week, right? We had a lot of movements last week. This is when I remind you though, there's that muscle actions review assignment in the last week of our lab folder. So it's like week 15 or 16. There's a folder that says lab final review week. Remember that there is an assignment that just reviews the actions of muscles. This is a week, starting this week, that if you have not already gone in and started to play with that assignment, please do that. Because by the end of this week, not only do you need to know the muscles that do face movement, you really should also remember your muscles that move the leg. And we really also should remember the muscles that move the torso. So a really good way to remind yourself of those movements is to go through and do that assignment. So please make sure that we're starting that review assignment. Remember, I'm only going to keep your highest score. So if you go in right now and you do it and you get a 50, by the time we're ready for the final exam, you're going to get a 100. but that 50 keeps you practicing right now. So please go back and do some practicing with some of those movements from last couple of weeks as well. I want to make sure that I take a moment here to do this too. We have one of those prediction activities in this lab packet. So the last thing in this lab packet is helping us to practice with our origins and insertions again. So one last thing we're going to do together is talk about, in particular, the sternocleidomastoid muscle. When we talk about the sternocleidomastoid muscle, the origin of this muscle is a bone marking called the manubrium of the sternum. We learned that a couple of weeks ago. And that bone called the clavicle, 2 bone markings. The insertion of the sternocleidomastoid is the mastoid process of the temporal bone. Before I draw these on my skeleton, remind me, is it the origin or the insertion that's going to move when a muscle contracts? Is it my origin or my insertion that moves when a muscle contracts? Yeah, the insertion is what's going to move when a muscle contracts. So let's start with our insertion. Our insertion is on something called the mastoid process of the temporal bone. I put a little green V on the mastoid process. When you are looking at this in your lab packets and invisible body, this one should be really easy to see. It's the big hanging down V off of the temporal bone. So that's my mastoid process. It's really massive on the temporal bone. My origins are on the manubrium of the sternum and the clavicle of the clavicle bone. So the manubrium of the sternum is the top part of the sternum. The clavicle is the bone that lives right next to it. Now I get to do my fun connect the dots. So connect my origins to my insertions. Here's my lovely sternocleidomastoid muscle that I just drew here. You told me when a muscle contracts that the insertion moves toward the origin. So I want you on your own body, I promise I'm not spying on you. On your own body, I want you to feel for this mastoid process back behind your ear. And I want you to move that mastoid process toward your sternum. I want you to bring them closer together. When I bring that bone behind my ear closer to my sternum, am I extending my skull toward the backside of the body, or am I flexing my skull toward the front side of the body? Yeah, exactly. I am flexing toward the front side. When we talk about the action of the sternocleidomastoid, we're flexing the skull anteriorly. This pulls your skull forward. This can also help us to turn the skull side to side. But this muscle, remember, here's my insertion. This always goes toward my origin. This is true of any muscle, whether we're talking about the legs, whether we're talking about the arms or the back. The insertion always moves toward the origin. Feel it on yourself, act it out on yourself to help you predict which action word is correct. Because remember, when we take the lab final exam, I'm going to give you some questions like this where we can't memorize it because it's not going to be a real muscle. It's going to be one that I made up. And you'll see an origin and you'll see an insertion, and we need to know who's moving and we need to know which direction it's going. Insertion always moves toward the origin, and then we have those muscle movement words that we know. I am officially out of time, but are there any last minute questions before I turn off the recording? Or shoot me a thumbs up if you feel as good as you can. give you your daily penguin. I made him a little small, so this is going to be dicey. Yeah, so Temiteo asked if the sternocleidomastoid muscle also helps with rotation. That is correct. Yeah, so the other function, when we talk about just one of the sternocleidomastoid muscles being activated at a time, we would say that it rotates the skull. When they are both activated, so when both of the sides of your skull, we use our two sternocleidomastoid muscles, that's when we pull the skull forward, when we do flexion. So if one side contracts, that's rotation. If they both contract, it's flexion. Yeah. All right, well, I am going to go ahead and shut off the recording. Remember that tomorrow we are doing lecture. We're going to finish up lesson number 9. We're going to start lesson number 10. So if possible, please try to start working on lesson number 10 so that you're familiar with some of the stuff about neurons. We're going to wrap up neurons next week, but we do want to try to make some good headway in them this week before we continue on. So good luck with this lab stuff. Don't forget about visible body. Do fret.